So today's talk is Catholic moral thinking and Catholic moral thinking and values theory or values appreciation. But we've already started with a prayer, so we'll go straight into it. One of the things, I want a little quote from Aristotle. Aristotle said many years ago, many centuries ago, the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. Therefore, it goes stands to reason that the life that is examined is actually the one that's worth living. Why? There's a particular understanding within that saying. Namely, that a person who is examining his or her life frequently is recognizing that there are things that they can do differently, that there are things that they can do better, that there are things that they've done that they haven't done so well. So the examined life is a life where there are lots of opportunities for stopping, taking stock, and saying, what can I do to improve? In fact, this is something that any successful person, any successful organization will do regularly. In Catholic terminology, it'd be like doing the examination of conscience. Who's heard that before? Yeah. Okay, all of you. So do an examination of conscience, you stop, you take stock. So the examined life, the unexamined life is not worth living. And when we come, this is no more true than when we come to the moral life. The moral life is the way in which we follow right and wrong. And we seek goodness or evil. Which means that we as human beings have a capacity for this, to be good or to be evil. Animals do not have a capacity for goodness or evil. They have no moral capacity. Plants, they have no moral capacity, unless you're talking about Venus flytraps, of course, you know. But even they don't have any capacity. A lion attacking a deer or a gazelle or something, there's no moral act. It's just following its instinct. That's yummy, it's prey, I'm going to go for it. So the moral life is something that is particularly exclusive to human beings because we've got the power of reason and because we've got free will. And those two combined work together to either make us better, more good, and confirm us in the goodness, or to make us more evil, God forbid. But we've seen examples in history of this, and we've seen examples of this in our own lives. Do we always choose what is right? Absolutely not. Sometimes I choose to do evil. And sometimes I've got a clear understanding of it, and sometimes less so. Very often I regret what I do wrong, and I'm grateful for what I do right, by God's grace. But the reality is that I do not always choose what is right. Now, the interesting thing about Catholic moral thinking and the moral life is very different from the creed. The creed is what I believe in, is what I subscribe to, is what has already been revealed. And that's something that I understand with my mind, but I also live with my heart. The moral life, on the other hand, is something that I primarily learn, and moral theology and moral philosophy, I primarily learn by doing it. It's like a trade, if you want to do that. You know, the classical distinction between a university course and a TAFE course. The TAFE courses were the trades and so forth, where somebody learning a trade was there. Now there's that distinction really has been blurred very much. And you've got a lot of TAFE courses are very small in some ways, but a lot of university courses have a lot more practical side to them, and a lot of TAFE courses also have a fair bit of theory attached to them. Now, so we learn the moral life by doing it, and the more we practice it, the better we become. How does this work? Because the human person is made up of body and soul. We're using the Greek understanding here, which is a bit different from the Hebrew understanding. But body and soul, and the soul has what we call two powers in it. We have the power of intellect, and we have the power of the will. The intellect is like a gigantic vacuum cleaner, but it's a spiritual vacuum cleaner. And the job of the intellect is to absorb reality. That's the first thing that your mind and my mind does without even thinking. We just through the senses that we have, we recognize that there are things around us. And then the second thing that the human mind does is we actually make a judgment about those things. We try to figure them out. This is all Aristotle, by the way. It's not Father Mark, it's not St. Thomas Aquinas, it's Aristotle. And so the first action of the human mind is to recognize that there is existence out there. There are things that are there. So it might be a table, window, person, a gazelle, a plant, building, whatever. We recognize there are things around us. The second thing is we try to put categories on them. We try to work out what it is. And that's what we mean when we say a judgment. Now, the will, on the other hand, is like a harpoon. But while the mind is a vacuum cleaner, spiritual vacuum cleaner, it absorbs everything that it sees, then makes a judgment about them. And by the way, the things that it sees are not just the things that it sees with its eyes, our physical eyes. There are many things that the human mind sees which are not visible. For example, what are some of the things that the human mind sees or captures? Maybe that's the better word. Captures, which are actually not visible. Yes?
The atmosphere?
Atmosphere. So we know there is an atmosphere. There is 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and what else is there? Anyway, 1% of something else. Makes sense. So physicists have told us that. We believe it, but we also know it's true because when we go somewhere where there's not much oxygen, it's nice knowing you, goodbye, you know, and off I go. So there's the atmosphere. That's a physical reality that's invisible. We also know that there is a thing called radiation. You know, electromagnetic radiation, nuclear radiation, that's in the background. That's buzzing through. We don't know it, but it's real. And if you don't believe me, just go and expose yourself to some radioactive substance and you'll see what starts to happen to you. Not immediately, but you'll die. So they're all physical realities. But then there are other things that the human mind captures that are actually completely immaterial. So even though the things of the atmosphere or radioactivity or microscopic stuff, which we cannot grasp with our senses, even though this is actually invisible to us, it is still on the physical realm. Then there are other things that are actually on the spiritual realm. In other words, we cannot touch them. Can you give me an example? Yes? Ideas. Love. Peace. Joy.
Yeah.
Yes, we associate joy with a certain feeling, but we understand joy as well.
Charity?
Sorry?
Charity?
Charity, exactly. So that's love of God, right? So love is a generic term. Charity is specifically love of God. We can talk about things like unity or a concept of universal. If I say to you the idea of chair, you know what a chair is in your minds. You just know this. Now I can give you a nice comfy chair like you're sitting on. I can give you an armchair. I can go and show you a particular chair in the cathedral right now, which is known as a cathedra. I can show you a chair that's a throne for a king. All very different chairs, but it's still a chair. I can show you a chair that we all sit on every day. And it's made of ceramic and it's got a flushing mechanism behind it. It's still a chair. And you understand the concept. You know, now it's not so much for comfort. Well, it is of comfort, of a different sort, you know. But you see, so they're all different chairs. I can show you the chairs of kindergarten children. But how is it that this same concept is there in your mind? It's because you have a capacity, and we as human beings, for intellect. Do animals show evidence of this? They don't, because they're not rational creatures. They're not known in made in the image and likeness of God. This is what makes human beings, therefore, open, and particularly they have a capacity for the moral life, to choose good or to choose evil. So the will is the harpoon that goes after whatever it recognizes to be good. And the intellect sees all the different things. It says, oh, that's lovely, it's beautiful, that's good. And whenever there's a goodness element there, that presents it to the will. So one's the spiritual vacuum cleaner, then presents it to the will, and the will goes after it. And without even desiring or wanting to, the will just goes after what is good. Now, it may not actually manage to do it in physical terms, but it will do it just in instinct, in desire. So, for instance, I may see a good, I don't necessarily have to go and buy it, I might just see a nice car or a beautiful plant. I love orchids. And when I see a beautiful orchid or a nice tulip, I live in the Southern Highlands, and the tulip festival, you know, be in October, I think it was, and I just see, wow, or just the beautiful trees around me. In May, particularly, those and autumn, those 2 weeks, you'd have reds and yellows and oranges, and I think, there's something beautiful. Without even wanting to, I go for it. Now, either I might get into the car and actually go and take physical action, or if I think of it, it makes me happy, even just describing it to you now. Why? Because it's a fundamental good thing, and I see it and I go for it. What's that bell for?
Angels.
Oh, the Angelus. The angel of the Lord declared unto Mary, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Behold the handmaid of the Lord. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. And the Word was made flesh. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Pray for us, O Holy Mother of God. Let us pray. O God, who beseech thee, O Lord, thy grace into our hearts, that we, to whom the incarnation of Christ thy Son was made known by the message of an angel, may by his passion and cross be brought to the glory of his resurrection, through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady, Hope of Christians. Great. So we continue. The role of the will then is like a harpoon. It goes to whatever it sees to be good. So it stands to reason, therefore, that whatever the mind understands as good is in fact what's going to present to the will as what is good, and that's what's then going to decide. So the mind, though, as we realize, can be shaped. Not every human mind unfolds in the ordinary sense of the word, in exactly the same way, does it? If that were the case, we would all think in exactly the same way. But we don't. And there are people around us, not too far from here, who actually think very, very differently from how we think. Think about the world and so forth. And it's because they've been shaped differently, they've been taught differently, there's different experiences in their lives. And as a result of this, the mind has learned to assess things and to value things in a very different way. As a result of this, you can actually get two people who are both thinking they're living a moral life and living a life of goodness, and be diametrically opposed to that. To give you a very clear and plain example, some think that capital punishment is a good thing. Others will say it is not a good thing. We don't really need it anymore. Or another example, euthanasia. Some will tell you, I think it's a good thing, gets rid of pain and so forth. And others will, and helps the elderly who are dying without proper control of their sufferings and so forth, to be able to end their lives. And others say, no, they have a dignity that is extraordinary, and we need to surround them with love and to give them better medication. And yes, give them strong enough medication that sometimes will accelerate their death, but we don't want to kill them because we love them. See, different points of view. How do we arrive at this kind of thinking? That's what these are going to help us to do. They're different moral theories, ways of assessing a situation, the rightness and the wrongness of a situation. So today's talk, and I promise to finish by 1:45, because I know some have to go early, but we've got a lot of stuff to get through. Anyway, by God's grace, we'll get through it. We're going to start off with a series of definitions, because if we don't know the definitions, we don't know what we're talking about. You'll be meaning one thing by it, I'll be meaning another thing. So we need to have definitions, agreed definitions. You may disagree with me in some of the ways I've defined things, but at least you will know what I mean when I'm saying that thing, okay? And then we've got different moral theories: utilitarianism, proportionalism, the categorical imperative, situation ethics, hedonism, and then finally we will get to the Catholic thinking. Now, I won't go to the Catholic thinking first without having examined all these others and shown up their mistakes, so that you will know then why Catholic thinking is as it is, and then we'll finish with that. If we have any time left for questions, we will do so. Okay, fasten your seatbelts. Let's go. So conscience, firstly, define conscience. Conscience, you'll see, is actually made up of two words. Conscienza. Con comes from a Latin word cum, which means with. Scienza means knowledge. So conscience means with knowledge. To understand and to do things with knowledge, with information. I hate using the word information by itself, because information is not actually knowledge. I can have all the information in the world, and really I'm nothing more than a computer. Knowledge means understanding the information correctly and joining the right dots between them. And then even knowledge by itself is what helps me when I use that properly to guide my life. I eventually reach that stage known as wisdom, which is knowing things in relation to their ultimate end. If at any point I say something that's not clear to you, please put your hand up, because if you don't understand it, someone else probably doesn't understand it as well or has that question. And I prefer to answer questions when the student has the question, because that's when there's a logical gap in the understanding, and I want you to be able to follow everything else I'm going to say to you. So conscience means to act with conscience, means to actually act with knowledge. So it's that capacity within us that enables us to act with knowledge. I'm going to say two things that conscience is not before I actually define it. Conscience is not your superego, which is a term that comes from, Sigmund Freud in the late 1800s, 1900s. And the superego, it comes from a Latin word and a Greek word. Super is Latin and ego is Greek. It means above the I, over the I, something above me. And the superego was Sigmund Freud's coining of a term that basically, as we grow up, as children, we're formed and we tend to attribute the voices of our parents and authority figures into our lives as to what is right and what is wrong. And a lot of those things could be things like family customs. As a child, we don't immediately distinguish that the rightness of how you dry yourself after a shower, or how you wipe yourself after you go to the toilet, or how you use your knives and forks, the right way of holding knife and fork. We don't necessarily distinguish between that and the rightness of always telling the truth, the rightness of not stealing. As children, we just learn all these things together, but eventually we start to distinguish, hang on a minute, I can actually hold my knife and fork any which way I like. I can dry myself with a big towel or a small towel. It doesn't really matter. See, they're not moral things, but they're things that we do as human beings. Do you see what I mean? Because that's how we actually start to get to a moral understanding of a situation. And so that's the superego. And we only do this as we grow older, and we begin to distinguish between the voices of our parents and the voice of our conscience. I haven't defined it yet, remember. Then there's another thing that is often mistaken as conscience, namely social convention. Social convention is simply the way in which our society does things. The way in which our society looks at, say, that when you burp publicly, you say, "Excuse me." Okay, it might be in another culture where burping is good on you, mate, you're enjoying your food. Yeah. And if you don't burp, it's a sign you're not enjoying your food. So you see, there's nothing intrinsic. By intrinsic, I mean innate, in the thing itself, that says burping and excusing yourself or not excusing yourself is right or wrong. It's socially conditioned. Okay? It's got nothing to do with something deep within human nature as such. We have another, let's say, a lot of our traffic rules. Our traffic rules says green light, well, we all know what traffic lights mean, right? Red means stop, green means go, and amber means go very fast. Okay, you do that too. So it's, you don't, all right. So you might have a society in which the red light means go, and the green light means stop. Well, we just adopt that. That's the social convention. It happens to be the law, and we go by that. And if you don't, okay, you risk causing an accident, you're a bad citizen, assuming you have a concept of what it means to be a good citizen, and you also get a hefty fine, right? So you don't do that. When we are crossing the road, well, we know that at a zebra crossing, a pedestrian has right of way. Well, that's a social convention that's also enshrined in law, but there's nothing essentially moral about it. We know that giving way to others, you open a door for someone who's elderly or a mother with a young child, you do that as a courtesy. There's social conventions, though, that are also happen to be acts of kindness and so forth. Conscience, though, to act with knowledge is always a judgment of the human mind on the morality of a human action. I'm going to give you St. Thomas Aquinas' definition of conscience first, and then I'm going to give you a much simpler one. St. Thomas Aquinas says that conscience is the proximate, practical, particular judgment of the human mind on the morality of a human act. The proximate, practical, particular judgment of the human mind on the morality of a human act. What's St. Thomas doing? First of all, it's a judgment. But notice he puts in 3 adjectives beforehand: proximate, practical, and particular. Proximate means you're actually close to the action. You're not far away just thinking about it in theoretical terms. That's not a judgment of conscience. It's practical. That I'm actually at the situation. I'm about to do some action. I'm not in theory. I'm not sitting at the table just doing a hypothetical case of a practical situation. Proximate, practical, and particular. So it's very, very proximate. And I'm doing that in order to actually, begin acting. Now, it's about the moral. Could someone open the door for that lady, please? It's just come through. And yeah, keep going, open the door. Just call her out, yeah. She should turn to the left, yeah.
Hello.
Anyway, she'll come. Yeah, she's coming around the back of the. Anyway, never mind. It's here she comes. So the proximate, practical, and particular judgment of the human mind on the morality of a human act. So moral on the morality of a human act. Welcome. Good. On the morality of a human act. So what the morality we're talking about something that can make us good or bad. Okay? So St. Thomas is using all these terms and loaded. We're just going through the definition of conscience. And so it's a loaded term. Then, the judgment of human mind on the morality of a human act. So notice is human act. And here I've got a definition I've got to get to. Acts of humans versus human acts. I'll get to that in a minute. There's a difference. So a human act is something, anyway, I'll define it when we get there. So that's St. Thomas's very detailed definition. A much simpler definition of the conscience. To act with knowledge, the last and best judgment of the human mind on the morality of a human act. The last and best judgment. So it's your best judgment when you are at that situation, judging morally as what we call a moral agent, as somebody who can act morally. And that comes from a professor called Germain Grisset, a modern day theologian. Okay, he's an elderly man now, but anyway, as far as I know, he's still alive. A couple of different things though, with conscience. The conscience can be well formed or badly formed, just like so many other things. And I'm going to give 2 examples of poorly formed consciences. There's the lax conscience. A lax conscience is everything is tolerable, nothing is wrong, everything is okay for me. Okay, so this is typically what we mean when we say about the licentious person who says, no, it might be wrong for you, but it's okay for me. I can steal if I think it's all right. I can lie if it gets me out of trouble. Close your son's ears there, maybe. I can lie if I'm going to get me out of trouble. I can cheat somebody if they're too foolish to wake up to what I'm doing. You see, that sort of person for whom they think everything is permissible. So a lax conscience. And why is that a wrong understanding of conscience? Because we know it's actually not true. And now, if it's actually not true, we are not conforming ourselves to the truth. It means in one form or another, we are actually harming ourselves. So when we do not follow according to an objectively well-formed conscience, and we make bad decisions, we actually harm ourselves. And we weaken the goodness within us, and we actually increase the evil. I should define good and evil, even though you all know what that is. But goodness is something that is actually positive. It exists. Evil is the absence of a good that should be there. That's a definition of evil. So evil is an absence. That's why when we have an injustice in our society, we typically think we're going to correct the injustice by punishing. Now, punishing, does it actually restore the justice, the injustice done? It actually just creates another one. But that's the only thing that we know how to do it. True justice is actually restorative. It restores the order that was there. That's why when we sin against God, we go to confession, the priest gives us a penance. The penance is meant to turn our hearts back to God, maybe in saying a prayer, doing something penitential, a mortification, whatever it is, but to turn our hearts back to God to help restore that relationship. So restorative justice is real justice. In other words, it removes the evil that was done and now restores the good that was there. Then, just with evil, there's moral evil and there's physical evil. Physically, but the same definition still holds good. A physical evil is the absence of a physical good that should be there. A moral evil is the absence of a moral good that should be there. Example, I have a disaster. I walk into a propeller or something, I have to get my arm amputated. I no longer now have my right arm. You'll say, don't worry, Father, when you get your glorified body at the resurrection of the dead, you'll have a perfect body once again. Say, thank you very much, but I happen to, eat with my right arm or something. I'm actually left-handed, so it doesn't matter. But it's, but I actually like looking symmetrical somewhat in photos, so it's, having two arms looks rather normal. But so there's a physical evil there in not having a right arm. I lose an eye, I lose a foot, whatever. That is a physical evil. A moral evil is the absence of a moral good that should be there. Okay, just a couple of concepts there. Now, so that's a lax conscience. A scrupulous conscience, on the other hand, is a psychological state. It means that it not only, it's got nothing to do with how my mind has been formed, but rather the fearfulness that has gone into my life and guides my actions. It's actually bypassing my thinking, and now I'm just deciding on what I do, basically by some voice that's whispering in the back of my head. So remember I mentioned those two other concepts of conscience that were not actually the judgment of the human mind, the superego and social convention. Yes? Just mentioned that. So the scrupulous person is listening to all these other voices except their own. The true conscience is when we sit down and say, what do I really believe? What do I think about this situation? Sharing my food, sharing my wealth with the poor, reaching out in love to a person who is needy, going out of my way to defend someone against an injustice, standing up to somebody who is committing theft, or whatever it is, challenging somebody who is a liar, and taking someone else's good name away and their reputation. So, scrupulosity, and scrupulosity finds sin where sin isn't there, finds evil where evil isn't there. So we talk about evil as if evil existed, but remember it's always an absence of something. It's an absence of a good that should be there. So that's a conscience. Vincible and invincible ignorance, that's supposed to be the one thing. What's that about? Ignorance comes from a Greek word, gnosko, so it means knowledge. So agnosis, so which is knowledge. Agnosis means without knowledge or unknowing. Yes?
Ignorance means you don't know things.
That's complete ignorance, absolute ignorance. But it means actually to be without knowledge. Without knowledge. So I may be without knowledge in this moral situation, but I actually have a lot of knowledge about working cars because I'm a mechanic. Or a computer, whiz. So I'm a lot of knowledge. So it's knowledge about particular things. And the ignorant, vincible and invincible ignorance about a moral situation. So what we're applying here are to the moral life. Vincible and invincible ignorance means the ignorance I have in a situation, one of it could be helped, vincible ignorance, and the other one is it cannot be helped, invincible ignorance. Let me give you an example. I may ask some of you a situation about, let's say a friend of yours comes and asks you about some teaching of the church. And they say, well, what's canon law say about the, I don't know, about the seal of the confessional that's been in the news lately? Or say about marriage and what we have to do to have a valid marriage. And you give them some information that may not actually be right. But to the best of your knowledge, it was right. That is ignorance because it's not knowledge, not correct knowledge, but it's invincible ignorance. How can I expect you to know something that you've never really studied? And the person has come to you asking you for information that you really were not able to give them. But they don't know somebody else who does. You're the closest moral person that they know. So they're going to you and to ask you all these things. And this situation happens all over the place, right? All over the world, constantly. Vincible ignorance, on the other hand, is if the person comes up to a priest and asks them something about some canon law thing or whatever, something that they should know, but maybe they didn't because they've been lazy, they didn't, study properly or whatever, then that is vincible ignorance. And so in terms of moral responsibility, it means that they are actually morally responsible for not knowing that. So some people can say, you know what, I actually didn't know, and they will be held innocent. Others say, I actually didn't know, but they're actually held guilty to some degree because they should have known. You ask a judge who's actually, or a magistrate, who's administering the law and doesn't know the law, and you can demonstrate that they don't know the law, you will have them removed from that office. And that would be rightly so, because they have a duty to know the law and to know it thoroughly, because that's what they are there to do. The same thing for a medical doctor, a nurse, whatever. So these categories also apply more broadly than just the moral life. Contraries versus contradictories. This again helps us to be more precise in our speech. What's contrary and what's a contradictory? Contraries mean black and white. They are contraries. We often, though, use that example as meaning contradictory. That is actually not contradictory. Contradictory means black and not black at the same time in the same instant. What am I getting at here? Because the human mind, whether you and I like it or not, we are just created this way. There's this law that operates within us called the law of non-contradiction, which means, put simply, is this. The law of non-contradiction means, or says, that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. In other words, if I had a chair in front of me here in the middle of the room, I can't say, you can't have both a chair and non-chair at the same time and in the same sense. Because that's madness. Either there's a chair or there isn't a chair. Okay? But I can have contraries together. I can have a black chair and a white chair. They're contraries, and they can sit together. But contradictories can never be found. If that were the case, then I'm sorry, the world is mad, and human nature's mad, and there's no rationality around. I cannot find order. It would be absolutely bizarre. And then all the things that we've discovered will actually be false discoveries because somebody has managed to lie significantly and effectively enough to actually convince all these millions of people, billions of people around the world that somehow their discoveries are genuine and that they are coherent and that they are rational. So the law of non-contradiction is actually very, very important, and that's at the basis of contrary versus contradictory. And you can see how when you come to the moral sense and the moral application of principles, that you actually, the law of non-contradiction is actually very important. Notice the other part of the law of non-contradiction, that it cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. The same time, I can have a chair here right now, but an hour from now, there's no chair. So I've got to tie it down to time, because we are in the world of space and time. But I can have a chair there and not there at the same time even, but in a different sense. I can say, in a chair, there's a chair there in the sense of my mind, my mental being. But in reality, there's no chair. Again, I'm not violating the law of non-contradiction because I'm talking about a different sense. Now, this might be new to some of you, but it takes a bit of time to get your mind around it. But it's actually something that you've been working on all your lives without even realizing it. It's just how we think. Connaturality means, again, con comes from the Latin word cum, with, and naturality means nature. So with nature, working with nature, which recognizes that nature has a capacity to grow. Nature has a capacity to move forward in a particular direction. So when we were little, we didn't know how to walk. We crawled. And then eventually, we start to walk at the age of whatever, one and a bit, or something like that. And now, the ability of a child to learn how to walk is already built in there. It's not something that just, the parents have to beg God to heaven, and say, oh, please allow my child to start walking. It's not. It's just part of working with nature. And the morality idea, the capacity to be moral, is part and parcel of being with, is co-natural, we say, co-natural with human nature. But it's not co-natural with beasts. It's not co-natural with beasts. Beasts have no capacity for moral action. So co-naturality. Teleology and deontology are two different things. Don't worry, we'll get there. Two different definitions. Teleology is a way of, it comes from a Greek word, telos, which means end, the word about the end. Deontology, I'll tell you about that in a minute. Teleology, so it's always focused towards the end. What is my intention? What is the final outcome? So it's always looking at the end. And that's where we get the principle, the end does not justify the means. Can I kill 2 people in order to save 50 others? Ooh. Can I kill 2 people in order to stop a building burning that costs, $500 million to... You see these? Now, we might say very simply, no. But not everybody would come out with that same outcome. Why? Because my intention is just to the end. So the end does not justify the means. On the other hand, deontology comes from 2 Greek words, deon, which means duty, and ology, word. So the word about duty. It's telling me what's important is the here and now. It's a moral system that's focusing on, if what I'm doing here and now, my duty, isn't good and right for me, then that's not what's important. I need to focus on what's now. What this is actually going to do for me right now, the good or the bad. Teleology, it says it doesn't really matter what I do here and now, what's going to be the outcome of it. And we will actually pick up these things in when we look at the moral object, the moral action in Catholic ethics in a few moments' time. And then finally, the difference between acts of humans and human acts. Acts of humans, as I mentioned, there's a whole lot of acts that we learn how to do. Eating with knives and forks instead of eating with our fingers. Other cultures in the world will eat with their fingers. You know what? They were the original knife and fork. Thank you very much. I can, whatever. We may sit down on the chairs to eat. I might sit down on the lounge. There's a whole lot of actions there that have no capacity. They're not moral actions. On the other hand, human acts engage the will and engage our moral power, our moral ability. When a volcano explodes and kills 10,000 people, has the volcano committed a sin? No, because a volcano doesn't have a moral capacity. And I gave the example also already, you know, a snake attacks a human being and bites them and kills them, or an electric eel shocks someone to death. It's just doing what it's designed to do in its nature. Our nature, on the other hand, is designed to be good, to be guided by right reason and to be led forward through free choice in order to go in that direction and to build up our moral character so that we become more virtuous. That's what we are meant to do and be as human beings. So acts of humans and human acts. Human acts are primarily those actions that involve the will and involve our moral capacity. Another human act that I might do, someone will tickle me and I react and I crack them in the head as I do so, and I happen to be a very strong boxer and I hit them so hard as I reacted, I actually knocked them out. Now is there sin there? There's no moral act. No, that's not an act, that's not a human act on my part. It's an act of humans. It's being done by a human being, but not a moral action as such. Good. Any questions on the definitions?
Yeah, I'd like to ask my father.
Please.
That last one, look, if you get hit,
Yes.
you react and you hit the other bite back. That's human reaction, isn't it?
It is. It's an act of human. It's being done by a human being,
Yeah.
but it doesn't engage my voluntary side. It hasn't engaged me in my moral reflection. Have I sat down, have I thought about it and said, okay, whenever someone tickles me, I am gonna just hit so hard, and I don't care if I knock them out.
That would
You know?
in what's the word? In like your defensive.
Yeah, self-defense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, self-defense again is another thing. We'll get to that in the principle of double effect. When I defend myself, but I end up killing the person. I'm doing something good by protecting myself, but one of the effects is actually something bad. So what do? How do I solve those moral dilemmas? Yeah. Question.
Connaturality.
Yes. Working with nature.
Capacity to grow.
Yeah, it's a capacity, exact capacity of nature. It's something that works with nature.
Okay, you said exclusive to humans, but animals have
Yeah,
the capacity to grow.
animals can do that too. It is a co-naturality with humans. But it's just a good thing. The moral life, though, is not something that the animals have a capacity to grow in. Whereas human beings have a capacity to grow in the moral life.
So this is pertaining to morality,
Yes.
naturality.
Yes, co-naturality. So, for example, I can give you the example of the two soldiers, a young soldier and an experienced soldier. The young soldier goes to war scared as hell, getting shot at, get killed, whatever, but he comes back and he comes from the war and he does his job, he kills the enemy and whatever. Now, he comes back, he's acted with courage to do that. The seasoned soldier has gone to war, and he's acted from courage. What's the difference? The seasoned soldier has fought many battles. The courage, that behavior of acting courageously, has been internalized for him. The young soldier doesn't quite know what it means yet, but he's got an idea of it. So he goes in there, does his best, succeeds, comes back victorious. The other guy, he's still scared, but he's acting from courage. So acting with courage or acting from courage are very important distinctions. And as we grow in our moral life, which is something co-natural, it works with our nature, then it's something that also keeps on growing, and the more we refine it and so forth. Any more questions? Let's get on to the different theories. This theory was first designed by John Stuart Mill about 100, 200 years ago. And John Stuart Mill was an economist. He was writing it. But eventually it became applied as a moral theory. And so it's looking at so utilitarianism is basically, put in a nutshell, is the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. You can almost memorize that. The greatest number of good, or the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. So if I can help 1,000 people, surely that's better than helping 100 people. And economically, you can see how this makes a lot of sense. But when you start applying it morally, okay, so can I abort 3 little ones if I'm going to make the life better for 10 people? Can I deprive people of some food in order to avoid a political scandal? You know what I mean? It starts to introduce factors that actually, maybe the theory works better as an economic theory, but as a moral theory, but you'd be surprised how often you find John Stuart Mill is alive and well. Is alive and well in our society, in our culture. People decide like this. Next, proportionalism. Proportionalism says that all the human goods are actually, however many there are, all the different goods. When you've got to make a moral decision, you've got to weigh up the goods that are at stake there. Okay? Convenience, friendship, health, psychological well-being, the pros and the cons. So proportionality says, or proportionalism says, that the way we judge right and wrong for a particular situation is by weighing up the goods and bouncing them off each other and saying, well, this is the thing to do under this situation. Now that might sound all very reasonable at a surface level, but actually when you start to look at it, you say, hang on a minute, so it's okay to kill someone or to destroy a marriage if it's going to make my life more comfortable. It's okay to deprive somebody of education so that I can go more frequently on a long holiday, an expensive holiday. Use the money in a different way. I mean, it's also a good, and in the holiday I see new things, experience new things, wonderful. But the person is deprived of an education, which is going to set them up for life. You see, now proportionalism will say, you just mix things around and you come to a decision. Now, who's going to guide you in how you come to that decision? You. Whoa, this is dangerous. Or me. I mean, it's not so easy to come to that understanding. And the goods, one good or another, how do you say which one is most important? The good of marriage, the good of well-being, the good of friendship, the good of life. Surely the most important good is the fundamental good, without which all the others cannot survive. So the good of life has to be at the basis. But within that, the good of friendship, the good of having work, the good of a marriage, all these things are, what's in some instances, maybe my friendship is more important to me. Maybe in another instance, it's actually the marriage is more important to me. So if the goods are being bounced around according to my changing circumstances, it doesn't say much about the moral consistency of my theory, does it?
No.
So proportionalism was actually knocked on the head by St. John Paul II in his letter on Veritatis Splendor on the 6th of August 1993. Then I'm going to get to the situation ethics, and then I'll get to the categorical imperative, which, okay, we're getting there. Now, the situation ethics is another theory that basically says you decide, there is no moral theory, you just decide according to your best judgment on that situation that you happen to be in. So, I happen to be in a situation where I'm under a lot of pressure and it's okay to take drugs to make it easier for me and make life calmer. I'm not talking about Panadols here, right? So, so that's one thing. You know, I am in a situation, I'm overseas and I have a terrible inclination and I can get away with it. I'm going to take advantage of some person that I come across. The one night stand or abuse of children or something like that. You know what I mean? It's so situation, that the situation is what dictates right or wrong. It's got nothing to do with who is actually acting here, that morality, that's something inscribed on the human heart, on human nature, that actually says what is right and wrong, i.e. the Ten Commandments. Okay, so situation ethics says it's the situation decides, I interpret the situation, determines what the right or wrong thing is. The categorical imperative was a definition that came up by a famous philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T, Kant. And he's German, started writing when the age of 60, and he basically was a deontologist. He said it's either about my duty here and now, or else it's not important at all. So it's the categorical imperative. And if it's to be done now, it's not only to be done by me, but to be done by every other human being under the sun, because it's part of the chip. Now, in some sense, as Catholics, we'd be thinking, yeah, you know what? Killing is killing is killing. It's wrong for anyone at any time. You know, there's a sense of sin to me, or sympathy that we find with Immanuel Kant. But Kant is only one part of the picture. So that's the categorical imperative. Hedonism says that right and wrong are to be decided by pleasure and pain. Do we know anyone who lives like that? Yeah. Oh man, half of our society, half of our culture, you know. Pleasure and pain is what decides what is right and wrong. But I have an infection. It starts as a red inflammation, then goes painful, and then I start to scratch it and I realize there's something really wrong there, and eventually I let it go, it becomes gangrenous, I lose my arm. My left arm, let's say this time. So, you know, what happened? The pain was actually an indicator of the evil. It was actually a good thing, because it was triggering me and alerting me to what was wrong, to what I needed to act on. So the pain was actually a good thing. I may be going through a great feeling of goodness. I have a drug and it makes me feel really good. Takes away all my pains and worries. Yeah, for a time, but I don't face the truth in my life. That the reason I'm feeling so bad is because I have some terrible relationships that are toxic in my life and I need to do something about them. Or I actually need to change some of my behavior in my life. Or I need to actually start working so that I can find fulfillment by exercising my gifts and creativity, and gives life to me because I see some fruitfulness to my labor. And that's the reason I'm feeling bad, because I've actually been lazy. So so pleasure and pain are hardly an indication for a valid, reliable moral system. So we then get to the Catholic ethics here, and we've got 5 minutes to go, and we're going to just make it over the line. Sorry, I'm going fast, but I'm willing to stay as long as possible afterwards, because I know some of you have to go. So there are 3 parts of the moral act according to the Catholic moral thinking: the moral object, the circumstances, and the intentions, or the end. Right? The moral object, the circumstances, and the end, or intentions. John Paul II talks about this in his letter, and it's also in the Catechism of the Catholic Church that is far more fully explained. The moral object simply means this: what am I actually doing? What am I actually doing? What is going on in this action? So the way I define my moral object is actually very, very crucially important. I may be in a submarine and we're all going out. Well, one of my submariners is rather chubby, And as he's going out, he blocks the pathway. And the submarine is sinking. What do? Well, I could try and pull him out, and he's lodged. He is stuck there, and I can put a little stick of dynamite and clear the passageway, right? And I can define it as I'm just clearing the passageway. That's what I'm doing. Or I can define it as I'm actually killing an innocent human being. So how I define what I'm actually doing is known as the moral object. And that is actually very, very important. You know, when it comes to real moral problems, you know, for instance, should a couple, is it right or wrong to use contraceptives? Is it right or wrong to use certain medication in an ongoing way? So what am I actually doing? Answering that question is actually very important. The circumstances are just what's around. You know, we're dealing with a person of special needs. We're dealing with a child. We're dealing with an adolescent. We're dealing with an elderly person. We're dealing with a person with full consciousness of the thing. We're in a situation where there's not a lot of money available. We're dealing with a situation where we're in a war zone. We're dealing in a situation where there's a famine going on. These are all circumstances, and they have an impact on us, and also have an impact on the degree of responsibility. I may be a sleepwalker, and I happen to be visiting some friend of mine. We're sharing a night together. We had gone to bed, watched our movie, and chatted and had a few drinks, and okay, great. I walk up in the middle of the night. I'm in a different house, and I'm walking about. One of my mates gets up, goes to the bathroom at night, and I think there's an intruder in my house, and I beat the living daylights out of him because I think there's an intruder. But I'm under the influence of my sleepwalking. I'm not a sleepwalker, right? But I mean, I'm just giving it as an example. The circumstances there would have an influence on what I've done. They actually mitigate my moral responsibility. And then the intention is, what are the effects? What am I wanting to bring about? So I do good things in order to bring about more good down the track. I cannot do evil things in order that good comes from it. I can have an actually good thing before me, but I have a bad intention, which will make the action bad. For example, I can give a lot of money to the poor, but I make sure everybody knows about it. Whereas the master has told us something else, hasn't he? Don't let your left hand know what your right is doing. When you say your prayers, you know, don't stand in the street corners. And yet we come to Mass and say our prayers because we're meant to support one another. But when we pray, we shouldn't be, you know, attracting attention to ourselves. We realize that we're in the presence of our Heavenly Father. And the same thing with a whole lot of things. So a bad intention will make a good action bad. A good action with a bad action with a good intention will make the overall action bad. A good action with a good intention will make the action good. And that's what's truly good, because there's an internal telos within us that our character must go in a particular direction. Okay, 1 minute over time. Explain simply the principle of double effect. The principle of double effect means this. I have one action, but there are two results that I foresee. One good and one bad. The good result that I foresee, I choose. The bad result that I also foresee, I do not choose. I reject that, but I permit it because it cannot be avoided. And the means to the end cannot be the evil effect. But, so the classic case, self-defense. You raised the question of self-defense, madam, and then, so someone comes to lunges at you with a weapon. It's clear, they want to kill you. And you're a trained soldier or a martial artist, you know very well how to defend yourself. And someone might say, well, why don't you just go to maim them or something like that? Assume that those options are not there. One time I was talking to a sniper for the police force. He had in his gun sights, he was one of these SWAT teams, gun sights, there was a man there, a knife, anyway, I won't talk about it because too many details, because there's minors here, but it was a clear case, and I said, can't you shoot to maim? Can't you do that? And he says, no, there's a 30% chance of ricocheting, I would have injured the child, blah, 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 I had to shoot to kill. Thank God he didn't have to on that occasion, but the point was that the only way to protect the innocent person was to kill the other. There was no other way. And the church says, yes, that is quite possible, quite legit, because the intention is to do the good. You foresee. So the Americans have another name for this. They call it collateral damage. But sometimes with collateral damage and all of that is all, it can be easily a manipulation. And if you want to see a very good film that I saw recently about all this question, it's called Eye in the Sky. Eye in the Sky is a great film about the dilemma, killing it to do good, but there's side effects and you foresee them but you don't intend them. Is it? Eye in the Sky. We've got to finish because we're a few minutes over time. So that is it in a nutshell. It's very hurried, I'm sorry to say, but yeah, we've got to, any quick questions? Because I know some have to go. Okay, great. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for listening.